In an upper room of an unoccupied dwelling in the part of San Francisco known as North Beach lay the body of a man under a sheet. The hour was near 9 in the evening. The room was dimly lighted by a single candle. Although the weather was warm, the two windows, contrary to the custom which give the dead plenty of air, were closed and the blinds drawn down. The furniture of the room consisted of but three pieces: an armchair, a small reading stand supporting the candle, and a long kitchen table supporting the body of the man. All these, as also the corpse, seemed to have been recently brought in for an observer. Had there been one, would have seen that all were free from dust, whereas everything else in the room was pretty thickly coated with it, and there were cobwebs in the angles of the wall. Under the sheet, the outlines of the body could be traced. Even the features, those having that unnaturally sharp definition which seems to belong to the faces of the dead, but is really characteristic of those only that have been wasted by disease. From the silence of the room, one would rightly have inferred that it was not in front of the house facing a street. It really faced nothing but a high breast of rock, the rear of the building being set in a hill. As a neighbouring church clock was striking 9 with an indolence which seemed to imply such an indifference to the flight of time that one could hardly help wondering why it took the trouble to strike at all. The single door of the room was open and a man entered, advancing towards the body. As he did so, the door closed, apparently of his own volition. There was a grating, as of a key turned with difficulty, and the snap of the lock bolt as it shot into its socket. A sound of retiring footsteps in the passage outside ensued, and the man, to all appearance, a prisoner. Advancing to the table, he stood a moment, looking down at the body. Then, with a slight shrug of the shoulder, walked over to one of the windows and hoisted the blind. The darkness outside was absolute. The panes were covered with dust, but by wiping this away, he could see that the window was fortified with strong iron bars crossing it within a few inches of the glass and embedded in the masonry on each side. He examined the other window. It was the same. He manifested no greater curiosity in the matter, did not even so much as raise the sash. If he was a prisoner, he was apparently a tractable one. Having completed his examination of the room, he seated himself in the armchair, took a book from his pocket, drew the stand with his candle alongside, and began to read. The man was young, not more than 30, dark in complexion, smooth shaven, with brown hair. His face was thin and high-nosed, with a broad forehead and a firmness of the chin and jaw, which is said by those having it to denote resolution. The eyes were grey and steadfast, not moving except with definitive purpose. They were now for the greater part of the time fixed upon his book, but he occasionally withdrew them and turned them to the body on the table, not apparently from any dismal fascination which under such circumstances it might be supposed to exercise upon even a courageous person, nor without a conscious rebellion against the contrary influence which might dominate a timid one. He looked as if, in his reading, he had come upon something recalling him to a sense of his surroundings. Clearly, this watcher by the dead was discharging his trust with intelligence and composure, as became him. After reading for perhaps a half an hour, he seemed to come to the end of a chapter and quietly laid away the book. He then rose and, taking the reading stand from the floor, carried it into a corner of the room near one of the windows, lifted the candles from it, and returned to the empty fireplace before which he had been sitting. A moment later, he walked over to the body on the table, lifted the sheet, and turned it back from the head, exposing a mass of dark hair and a thin face cloth, beneath which the features showed even sharper definition than before. Shading his eyes by interposing his free hand between them and the candle, he stood looking at his motionless companion with a serious and tranquil regard. Satisfied with his inspection, he put the sheet over the face again and returned to the chair. took some matches off the candlestick, put them in the side pocket of his sack coat, and sat down. He then lifted the candle from its socket and looked at it critically, as if calculating how long it would last. It was barely 2 inches long. In another hour, he would be in darkness. He replaced it in the candlestick and blew it out. In the physician's office in Kearney Street, 3 men sat about a table, drinking punch and smoking. It was late in the evening, almost midnight. Indeed, and there has been no lack of punch. The bravest of the 3, Dr. Halberson, was the host. It was in his rooms they sat. He was about 30 years of age. The others were even younger. All were physicians. The superstitious awe with which the living regard the dead, said Dr. Halberson, is hereditary and incurable. One needs not to be ashamed of it than of the fact that he inherits, for example, an incapacity for mathematics or a tendency to lie. The others laughed. "Oh, the man not to be ashamed to lie?" asked the youngest of the 3, who was in fact a medical student not yet graduated. "My dear Harper, I said nothing about that. The tendency to lie is one thing. Lying is another." "But do you think," said the third man, "that this superstitious feeling, this fear of the dead, reasonless as we know it to be, is universal? I am myself not conscious of it." "Oh, but it is in your system for all that," replied Halberson. "It needs only the right conditions, what Shakespeare calls the Confederate season, to manifest itself in some very disagreeable way that will open your eyes. Physicians and soldiers are, of course, more nearly free from it than others." "Physicians and soldiers? Why don't you add hangmen and headsmen? Let's all have the assassin classes." "No, my dear Mancher, the juries will not let the public executioners acquire sufficient familiarity with death to be altogether unmoved by it." Young Harper, who had been helping himself to a fresh cigar at the sideboard, resumed his seat. "What would you consider conditions under which any man or woman would be insupportably conscious of his share of our common weakness in this regard?" he asked, rather verbosely. "Well, I should say that if a man were locked up all night with a corpse alone, in the dark room of a vacant house, with no bed covers to pull over his head, and live through it without altogether mad, he might justly boast himself not of woman born, not yet, like Macduff, a product of Caesarean section." "I thought you never would finish piling up conditions," said Harper. "But I know a man who is neither a physician nor a soldier who will accept them all, for any stake you like to name." "Who is he?" "His name is Jared, a stranger here. Comes from my town, New York. I have no money to back him, but he will back himself with loads of it." "How do you know that?" "He would rather bet than it. As for fear, I dare say he thinks it's some cutaneous disorder, or possibly a particular kind of religious heresy." "What does he look like?" Halberson was eventually becoming interested. "Like Mancher here, he might be his twin brother." "Accept the challenge," said Halberson promptly. "Awfully obliged to you for the compliment, I'm sure," dropped Mancher, who was growing sleepy. "Can't I get into this?" "Not against me," Halberson said. "I don't want your money, alright," said Mancher. "I'll be the corpse." The others laughed. The outcome of this crazy conversation we have seen. In extinguishing his meagre allowance of candle, Mr. Jared's object was to preserve it against some unforeseen need. He may have thought too, or half thought, that the darkness would be no worse at one time than another, and if the situation became insupportable, it would be better to have a means of relief, or even release. At any rate, it was wise to have a little reserve of light, even if only to enable him to look at his watch. No sooner had he blown out the candle and set it on the floor at his side than he settled himself comfortably in the armchair, leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping and expecting to sleep. In this, he was disappointed. He had never in his life felt less sleepy, and in a few minutes he gave up the attempt. But what could he do? He could not go groping about in absolute darkness at the risk of bruising himself, at the risk too of blundering against the table and rudely disturbing the dead. We all recognize their right to lie at rest, with immunity from all that's harsh and violent. Jared almost succeeded in making himself believe that considerations of this kind restrained him from risking the collision and fixed himself to the chair.